The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today, Why Faith is Fundamental in Ending Domestic Violence. My name is Jane Fredrickson. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, a few how-tos. First of all, you should now be hearing me on your computer or through your phone and seeing the title of the webinar on your screen. If you're having any technical problems, please send me a message by using the chat feature on the right side of the screen, and I will help resolve the issue, hopefully. And we welcome your questions as you listen to the presentation today. We ask that you go ahead and send questions in at any point during the presentation using the Q&A feature on the right side panel, and we'll hold all the questions till the end of the presentation. The slides that you see on your screen today will be emailed to you later this afternoon so that you can refer back to the information and resources after we conclude today. And then lastly, we are recording this webinar to make it available to on our website for those who can't join us for the live session. This webinar is the first in a series of 12 webinars sponsored by the Lutheran Community Foundation in 2014, and it's a part of their Ending Family Violence initiative. Past webinars sponsored by the LCF are archived on our website as recordings, so I encourage you to go check those out. And the graphic on the left that you see is a flyer for the whole 2014 Lutheran Community Foundation series. And I'll send that to you today as well. Please visit their website, thelcf.org, to read more about this series and the other great work that they're doing, and we really thank the Lutheran Community Foundation. Again, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box on the right side panel of the screen. So on to our presentation. Julie Owens was unable to join us today, so Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune is here today to present this webinar. Dr. Fortune is the founder and senior analyst here at Faith Trust Institute, a minister in the United Church of Christ. She founded Faith Trust Institute in 1977. A graduate of Yale Divinity School, she is a pastor, educator, and author, as well as a practicing ethicist and theologian. Her books include Keeping the Faith, Guidance for Christian Women Facing Abuse, and Sexual Violence, The Sin Revisited. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fortune.
Thank you very much, Jane. I appreciate that, and welcome to everyone on the webinar today. Very sorry that Julie Owens is not with us. She would be here, except that she had a family emergency yesterday, and so I'm pinch hitting for her today. But part of Julie's presentation, whenever she talks about the issues of faith and domestic violence, is she always shares some of her story because her experience is such a primary example of how faith is fundamental to addressing domestic violence. And for those of you who don't know Julie, I just want to briefly tell you a little bit about her. She's the daughter of a prominent Presbyterian minister and was married to a man who abused her. They had, at the time, a young son. And she'd been battered by him over a period of time and really struggled with what she needed to do about that, particularly around the issues of her understanding of her Christian faith and her expectations of commitment to her marriage and to staying in the marriage. until she reached the point that it became intolerable and she decided to leave, and at which point her abuser attacked her and her father, who happened to be there at the time that he came to that. And he stabbed her and her father, seriously injured both of them. He ended up in prison for the assaults. And so after that, after Julie recovered from that and her father recovered from that attack, they both began to speak publicly about their experiences. And her father began to preach about domestic violence. And Julie, ever since, has been a strong vocal advocate working on issues of domestic violence, both in the wider community and in the church. So it's her experience that she would have brought to this webinar today. So we're just very sorry that she couldn't be with us. But if you want to know more about her story, we tell her story in our DVD, Broken Vows, which will be listed on the resource list at the end of the webinar if you're interested in knowing more about that. So, next slide, please. I want to do a very quick review of the nature of domestic violence. And before I do that, I want to just share some assumptions with you that I bring to this discussion. I'm assuming that each of you on the call today is in some helping role addressing domestic violence. You're either an advocate, a faith leader, a concerned volunteer, or you bring your own experience within your own faith group to this discussion. I also assume that you're taking this webinar because you already know that there's some important connection between faith or religion and domestic violence. And as we say here at Faith Trust Institute, we strongly believe that faith is fundamental to ending domestic violence. So I want to give you today some handles on the connection between faith and domestic violence and some resources that I hope will make you even more effective in the work that you do to end this problem in our society. So when we understand domestic violence, part of being able to address it effectively is to really understand what it's about. It is a pattern of assaultive and coercive behaviors. Those behaviors may be physical, psychological, sexual, or economic. And we see it happening between adults or adolescents, in which one person uses these behaviors against their intimate partner. But fundamentally, it's about power and control in that relationship. And so it may be visible, it may be not visible to people on the outside, and that's often what's difficult for any of us as family members or as a pastor or a rabbi or a counselor or a coworker. We may not see clearly visible signs of abuse because the coercion and control may be much more subtle than that. Next slide. So in the physical behaviors will involve everything from hitting, punching, slapping, use of weapons, threats of use of weapons, acts of violence against family members, as well as the primary victim, and attacks against property or pets that belong to the victim. So the abuser may never have physically been violent with his or her partner, but may have been violent with the pet that belongs to that person. And part of the effectiveness, if you will, of that violence is that both is very painful for the victim, but it also represents a threat see what I'm doing to your dog or your cat, and I can do this to you if I choose to. Sexual assaultive behaviors include coerced sex, forced sexual contact of any form in a intimate relationship, rape within marriage or a committed relationship, and so forth. The psychological aspect of assaultive behaviors, threats, the emotional abuse of humiliating the person, degrading them, calling them names, telling them they're no good, no one else will want them, that kind of thing. Isolation is a very common part of this, and it's one of the things that sometimes for those of us in faith communities that we can begin to see and be concerned about. For someone who's been very active in their faith community suddenly becomes absent because their abuser has told them that they can no longer participate in the faith community activities. The use of children, particularly in threatening that, if you leave me, I will take the kids. Very, very powerful coercion to force a victim of abuse to stay in an abusive relationship. And for immigrants, folks who don't have documentation and so forth to be in the United States, the threats of deportation, again, very powerful psychological coercion to stay in the relationship and not seek help outside of it. And then certainly the economic issues. So many victims are caught in a situation where they cannot economically survive outside of the relationship, or at least believe that they can't. They may not be working outside the home. They may not have job skills to do that. A variety of reasons that might be an issue. And even if they are working outside the home and have a salary, they may not have control over that money. So the economic coercion can be very insidious. So this is basically what we're looking at in terms of the kinds of dynamics and experiences that people describe in relationships with abusive partners. Next slide. So the intersection of those experiences then with religion is the topic for today. And fundamentally, I think what I want to leave you with is an understanding that a person's religious beliefs or faith will be either a roadblock or a resource. And for either person, for either the person being abused or for the batterer, that it will function in one of two ways. And so I want to illustrate that with a couple of situations. A number of years ago, there was a man in California who was arrested for marital rape. He had been abusing his wife for some period of time, but what finally came to a head was she was trying to get away from him, and she locked herself in their bedroom. He broke down the door and to get to her, and then he raped her. And so she finally went to the police, and he was charged under California law with marital rape. His defense at his trial was that he was a Roman Catholic and that his church, he had been taught by his church that once he married his wife, that meant that he had sexual access to her at any time that he chose. And so what he basically was arguing was that his right to religious freedom and the teachings of his church meant that he shouldn't even have been arrested for this crime of rape in his marriage. So this is an example of how at least his understanding and his use of what he thought to be the teaching of the church really became a roadblock for her, because I'm sure he had communicated to her in the process of his abuse of her that he was justified to do so, but also that he tried to use that as his defense in his the criminal prosecution that he was experiencing. Fortunately, in that case, the judge was not impressed by his argument, and he was convicted of rape. But the press at that point was covering the trial, and they went to the office of the Archdiocese to ask for their comment on this situation where the man had said that it was the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church that justified him forcing his wife sexually. To their credit, the Archdiocese said, no, that's really not what we teach. That's not what we believe. We believe that marriage is sacred, and we teach that husbands should respect their wives, and so forth and so on. And that was good. But as I was reading that article, I remember thinking to myself, okay, and what else are you going to say? And unfortunately, they didn't say anything else. I wanted them to say, and it's also the teaching of the church that domestic violence is a sin. This man clearly has been abusing his wife, and that is contrary to everything we believe as a church. That's what we want faith communities to be able to do, so that they become resources rather than roadblocks in these situations. One other story of a roadblock was a woman who called us, and she had been put in the hospital by her husband. He'd broken her leg, and when she was active in her church, and when she got out of the hospital, she had contacted her pastor and her church and shared with them what her experience had been, asking for their help and support. Her husband had also been a member of that congregation. And the response she got from her pastor was that he was really sorry for what had happened to her, but that the church would not be able to support her because he said, you have to understand that we can't take sides in this situation. And so she was calling me for support and to tell her story about this. And so I supported her and encouraged her and told her that I thought what she was told by her church was wrong and so forth. But I realized when I got off the phone with her that what I wanted to say to that church was, have you read the Good Samaritan story? Do you understand what the expectation of the teachings of the Christian faith are around the importance of us standing with persons who have been victimized and harmed, that is our job, and that we can do that in ways that both support that person, but also to confront the person who's abused her and caused this harm to her and call that person to repentance and so forth. So again, for her, her church was a real roadblock to her dealing with her experience of violence, and I'm sure she never ever again went back to that church, and I would support her in that because it was not a safe place for her if that was their understanding of how they wanted to relate to this situation. So those are just two very brief examples of how faith teachings are roadblocks to people being able to deal with the violence that may be happening in their lives. Now, the good news side of this is that faith and religious teaching can also be a resource. And so a couple of stories to illustrate that. One was a woman who, when she was abused by her husband, she went immediately to her priest, and he was very supportive and concerned for her safety and safety of her children, supported her through the divorce process, and the congregation rallied behind her because she had to find a place to live, and she had to find a job and get back on her feet in order to support her children. And they financially supported her for the first year so that she could manage that. And then when it came time for a custody hearing for her children, her priest and several leaders from her congregation were in court with her to testify on her behalf and support her through that process. So for her, what she said after that was that the only thing that got her through this experience was her church and her faith, that she knew that God was with her, and that gave her the strength to get through this. Another example would be in Jewish communities. The teaching in Judaism about Shalom Bayit, which means peace in the home, is a teaching which, for some Jewish women, is the point at which they are able to say that what's happening to them in being abused in their home is not acceptable, and that they will seek help and seek to remove themselves from that situation. Because if they understand that peace in the home is the expectation of what it means to be a Jewish family, and clearly the abuse is in violation of the peace of the home, then that's something that encourages and supports them to seek help outside, to go to Jewish family services often, and many of those organizations now have special programs for battered women and are prepared to be of assistance to them. So their faith becomes the resource that helps them deal with their situation and be safe. So we can talk more about that as we go through, and if you have specific questions about that. But the fundamental point is that faith will operate either as a resource or a roadblock. It will never be neutral. It will never be not significant. It will never be something that people can set aside and put it over here and say, I'm gonna go here and deal with this violence in my life, but I'll come back and deal with my faith later. It's operative. It's always operative for people of faith who are struggling to address the violence in their lives. And it may be an understanding of their faith either from their childhood understanding or their adult experience as someone who's active in a faith community. But as I talk with victims and survivors, it's always in there somewhere. And it's frequently connected and intertwined with people's cultural experience and cultural issues that they know from their family and their community. So, for example, the particular experience of an Irish Catholic woman, what it means to be Irish Catholic and what the particular customs and expectations are that are both cultural and religious are a significant part of her journey in addressing the possibility that she's being abused. Or for an African American Baptist woman, the particularity of growing up in the Baptist church as an African American woman, those things that's going to shape her options, her understanding, and the potential for her community to support her in her situation. Certainly for an Orthodox Jewish woman, the particular understanding of what it means to be a family within Orthodox Judaism and the expectations and so forth there are all going to interact for someone dealing with violence. For an immigrant Somali woman who's Muslim, there's just no question that her faith issues, her immigrant status also, and her cultural background are all going to be a significant part of even how she understands what's happening to her and her ability to seek help and resources in the face of that. So I just want to flag that in terms of addressing faith issues is part of cultural competency for those of us who work in the wider community of addressing domestic violence. That cultural competency is very important and includes a person's faith history and experience. So as we say on the slide here, in the face of this, our task is to deconstruct the roadblocks and reconstruct the resources. In other words, remove the roadblocks that faith may represent or particular teachings or interpretations may represent, and help people find the resources of their faith community. Because the reality is that for most victims of domestic violence, they are not going to walk away from their faith community and their faith tradition. It's too important to them. And so it's not an option, as I said, to put it on the shelf and say, I'll get back to that later. So our job, if we're to be helpful to people, is to help them remove the teachings or the understandings or the responses of faith communities that are roadblocks, and help them then find within their faith experience what are the resources that strengthen, encourage, and support them in removing themselves from a dangerous situation, finding safety, supporting their children, and getting on with their lives and so forth. So let's go to the next slide, and I want to frame this within four goals of what is our task. And I would say that this is our task, whether you're working in a secular setting as an advocate or in a faith-based setting as a faith leader, that the first priority of our response to an individual is safety for the person and their children. And these four goals are in linear order in terms of priority. So the first priority is safety. And our job, if someone comes and discloses to us that they're in an abusive situation, is to do whatever we can to ensure their safety. And for those of us who are faith leaders, someone comes to us and from our faith community, one of the things that means is making sure that the person is connected to the resources in the wider community for shelter, law enforcement, if they choose to call on law enforcement, so that we draw on the wider community to help provide safety for that person and make sure they have those options. The second priority is theological clarity. And again, this is primarily the responsibility of a faith leader, but for those of you who are advocates in a secular setting, I also encourage you to refer people to faith leaders whom you trust to help with this part of what people need, because they need someone that represents their faith community to be able to reassure them and help them find those resources and clarify where teachings of their faith have been misused and exploited by an abusive person to create those roadblocks. Thirdly, the priority is for accountability for the batterer, the person who's caused the harm. And again, this is the responsibility particularly for the faith community, but also for the secular community. This is why in some situations law enforcement is important to intervene and call that person to account legally, but also within the faith community to be a part of that accountability, to work in concert with the person who's been arrested, they're facing prosecution, to work in concert with that process. So I would illustrate that by saying if, let's say, you're a pastor and you read in the paper that a member of your congregation has been arrested for domestic violence and is in jail for the time being. Your job is to go there and visit that person and assure him or her that you will be present with them as they face the process of accountability. Sometimes pastors or rabbis or imams are pulled in at that point in defense of the abuser, often requested to be a character witness in defense of that individual at trial. And one of the things when I am teaching with clergy that I encourage them to think about is if, let's say a defense lawyer calls me and says, you know, Joe Smith, a member of your church, has been arrested and is facing these charges. Will you come down and testify at trial as a character witness? And my response to that is, yes, I will come down and testify at his trial, and here's what I will say. I will say that Joe Smith is a member of our congregation. He's been a member for 25 years. He sings in the choir, he teaches Sunday school, he tithes, he's a very faithful member of the congregation, and I have no reason to believe that he did not beat up his wife and put her in the hospital. And so what I find is I've never had the opportunity to testify at trial because defense lawyers don't want somebody coming in and saying that. But the point is that for any of us who know this individual, we know part of them, but we don't know all of them. And what I know about domestic violence is the public-private split means that her allegation that he put me in the hospital makes perfect sense in terms of that's very, very common. So I would not be willing to testify that this is a fine, upstanding, faithful Christian in lieu of her safety and supporting her in calling this person to account. So that's a place where those of us who would be in that kind of position may be called upon to be part of the accountability process for the abuser and to walk with them to, in Christian terms, we would call that helping that person to repent and to change their behavior and be accountable for the harm that they've caused. So fourthly, in terms of the goals, the restoration of relationship is a very valid goal between the victim and the abuser, if possible. And we have to be very careful about that because it may not be possible. The brokenness, the harm that's been caused may be too great, in which case we need to help those individuals in mourning the loss of the relationship and moving on with their lives. And that may then mean a divorce and so forth. But when I work with clergy, one of the things that I find with them is that often out of just not understanding what's going on, they're very quick to begin with goal number 4, that they see their job as maintaining this marriage often or family unit or what have you in spite of the violence because they understand that to be the expectation of their faith tradition. And what I try to help them understand is that the relationship has already been broken by the violence and not by the victim seeking a divorce from the abuser. So that the restoration process has to take place in the context of the first 3 goals being accomplished. In other words, the victim and children have to be safe, really safe. The theological issues have to be clarified, and the abuser has to have been accountable for the harm that they've caused before we can even talk about possibly healing a relationship. And then it's up to the victim survivor and whether or not they even want to pursue that. And it's their choice if they feel like it's simply the damage is too great and they cannot pursue renewing that relationship. But if we start there as a faith leader and basically see our job as trying to keep the family together, if you will, we are part of the problem, and we become a roadblock to addressing the real violence and harm that is being done within that relationship or family unit. So I find in my pastoral work with people that I use these goals as sort of my touchstone for what my job is. And because often these situations can be complicated, and it's easy to get lost in the particulars of people's life situations. But I always come back to these 4 things that I'm supposed to be helping with as someone who's part of intervening in a situation to guide me towards what I can do that would be helpful to them. So I just offer them to you in that regard. So next slide. In terms of the spiritual crises that people experience, just to highlight a few of these, survivors talk about their struggles with why did God let this happen. That's a very common concern for many people who suffer various kinds of trauma, and coming to terms with where God is in that traumatic experience and in this violence and abuse. That it is not God who allows this, it is not God who brings this on a person, but in fact someone has stepped in and done harm to the other person, and God is not a part of that except to be present in the pain and suffering of the victim. Why doesn't God hear my prayers? Again, if the person's struggle is, praying to God to stop this violence, to help the husband or the partner stop the abuse, that's not going to stop it in terms of an abuser who's determined to maintain this behavior and continue to control their partner. Do I have to forgive? The whole question of forgiveness is a huge issue, particularly in the Christian community. And basically, what my concern is about that is when the community or the faith leader are the ones that impose that expectation or sense of obligation on the victim, we're doing that person a disservice, because forgiveness only happens way down the line when there has been some change in the situation, when the person feels safe and is no longer facing that violence, and then the choice to forgive is a choice to let go and move on with their life. But in terms of both sacred texts and the theology behind that, many within Christian communities go to the forgive and forget response, which is basically asking the victim to deny their experience and to not address it and not ask us to help them address it, when in fact forgive and forget is not a biblical teaching, but really comes to us from Shakespeare, and it's not the path that is going to help this individual deal with the situation that they're in. Will the community or God hate me if the marriage ends? No. again, the brokenness that violence brings to a covenanted relationship, God understands that brokenness and is present to the individual in the brokenness. And again, it's clarifying what actually is happening here, and that the person is not expected to stay in a situation that is in fact dangerous and damaging to them and to their children. Am I being punished for my sins? That's always a hard one, because again, people are always struggling with, why is this happening to me? And sometimes they look to answer that question with, well, it must be because I did such and such before. And again, that's not an adequate understanding of why we experience trauma in our lives, particularly at the hands of someone else. So am I a bad Christian, Muslim, Jewish person, Sikh, Buddhist, wife, whatever? No. And again, that's such a struggle for people, because if they have been taught in their tradition that to be a good wife or a good partner in an intimate relationship means such and such things, and staying in that relationship no matter what, it's very hard then to be confronted with the need to leave that relationship in order to be safe. But it's up to the faith community to reassure that individual that that doesn't mean that they are a bad person or unfaithful to their tradition. Next slide, please. So some of the other spiritual dilemmas, the fear and guilt issues that depending on the teachings of the tradition around divorce, that God hates divorce. What God hates is when people are harmed in relationship and when those covenants are broken. And that's what's going on in domestic violence. Reporting the abuse, that's always an issue for victims of domestic violence, whether reporting to law enforcement, reporting to other members of their family, or to a faith leader. It's very hard to disclose. But we have the capacity, both in the wider community and in interfaith communities, to open the door to folks and offer ourselves as a resource that if this is going on for you, you can come to me, you can talk about this, and I will walk with you through the situation. Some people describe faithlessness or a sense of infidelity, particularly if they do decide to divorce a husband or wife. And if only their faith were stronger, that they would be able to stay in this situation and persevere and so forth. That's not what God expects. That's not healthy for them or for their children. And it's not about not having a strong enough faith. It's about making a decision and choosing life in the midst of that situation. The belief that God is punishing me, again, for being a bad person or for something I did. Again, people are trying to explain why did this happen. And I think it's part of the human condition that when any of us experience trauma or illness or the death of someone we love or whatever it may be, we do ask that question, why is this happening to me? And it's not an easy question to answer. There's no simple, neat, and tidy answer to that question. But that's the struggle that people are having. If I can figure out why, then I can change something to ensure this won't happen to me again. It doesn't work like that, particularly in terms of harm that we experience at the hands of another person. If someone makes the choice to use violence against us for whatever reason and in whatever context, it's not about us, and unfortunately, we happen to receive that violence and have to deal with it. But it's not God's will. It's not something that we should tolerate in any way. Next slide. So just in terms, again, of setting a context for what is helpful to people in responding to their experiences of violence within a faith setting, I just want to highlight these things as ways that we can be a resource to people. The first is to create a setting in which people can share their experience, can tell their story. Those of you who are advocates experience this all the time when people come to you for help and you listen to their story. That's an absolutely critical part of their healing process, is to know that there are people who will listen, who understand, who will not condemn and judge them. And those of us in faith communities need to offer that as well. An openness to hearing people's story and experience and understanding what that means to them. So that the second topic, acknowledging what we're hearing, and what I always try to do in that pastoral moment is to find ways to express that I hear you, I believe you, and it should never have happened to you, to take a position in relation to the experience that they're sharing. And then compassion is our capacity, again, as members of faith communities or advocates in the wider community, our capacity to suffer with that person, to walk with them through this process, and to accompany them and provide resources for them so that they can come out on the other side of this. And finally, the responsibility to protect those who are vulnerable from further harm. So whether it's offering them safe shelter or support and encouragement in their faith community, protecting their children, calling on law enforcement when that's appropriate, but that part of responding and creating that context for healing is doing everything we can to ensure that no further harm comes to anyone. Next slide. So basically what survivors need is to be heard, to be believed, to experience that compassion and support, to find spiritual direction in terms of clarification of the teachings of their faith tradition. This is where faith can be a resource to them. The advocacy, particularly of those of you who work in secular settings to support people as they make their way through the legal system or the child welfare system or whatever system they're having to deal with. And survivors need accountability for the person who's harmed them, and that's our responsibility in the wider community. And all of this represents an experience of justice in a very concrete and profound way that is very important basis for their healing and for their future. Next slide. So I want to stop and take your questions, and then I'll conclude and highlight some of these resources that you can find here at Faith Trust for further in deepening your understanding of these issues. But I want to see if you have questions at this point.
So Marie, we do have a couple of questions. Can you speak a little bit more about forgiveness and the response to when someone says forgive and forget?
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's what people hear from members of their faith community or from family members, and it's well intended. People are trying to help someone who's experienced this trauma, to help them move beyond it. But it's not helpful, because at that point, particularly early in the process when nothing else has happened, it doesn't help them move beyond it. It merely shuts them down. and basically says to them, we don't want to hear you talk about this anymore, because if you're a good Christian or a good Jew, you should be able to simply forgive and move on. And by that they mean forgive, just don't deal with this. And it only encourages denial and minimization of what's happened to them. If people experience the kinds of things that I've described here in terms of the response of the community, and which we sort of summarize under justice as a category, when people experience that, they begin to be able to be empowered then to let go of the immediacy of the trauma and get on with their lives. But in the absence of that, it's not enough to simply say to somebody, you need to get over this and get on, and basically we had no responsibility as your community to help you do this. In fact, we have a huge responsibility to create the circumstance in which they find the resources they need. And my experience in working with individuals is then at some point they get to that point where they realize that they have let go and have moved on, so that it's not so often a kind of act of will of I'm going to forgive, but it's an experience of the phenomenon of forgiveness, which I, as a person of faith, think is a gift from God as part of our healing process. But it's not something that they can do in a vacuum. And it's not just their responsibility. It's our shared responsibility to create the context in which they find support, they find acknowledgement, they find people who are willing to hear their story, they find a community that holds their abuser accountable. And out of those experiences, people come to a place where they basically say, okay, I'm done now. Not that I'm going to forget about it. It's going to be part of my history and memory and scars, but I'm not going to let it continue to limit who I am and what I need to do in living my life, and I'm ready to move on. And so that's our job as either advocates or faith leaders, to help people find those resources to get to that point. But whenever we impose on people an obligation that says you need to forgive, even with the best of intentions, we're not helping. We're in fact creating a further roadblock for people.
Thank you. The next question is, what should you do? What's the first thing you should do if you think someone is in danger and you're not quite sure how to approach them, it says?
That's a really good question, and I think about that every so often. When I was an intern during my seminary training, I was living in an apartment building, and this was way back in the 70s, before I was really working on these issues, and certainly before I had any training in addressing these issues. And I remember so clearly that the couple that lived downstairs from my apartment, I now know she was being battered by her partner, because I could hear the noise, I could hear the screaming, the throwing against the wall, all that represents. And when I think back on that, I realize I had no idea what to do about that, and I didn't do anything, and it's one of those regrets that I still carry. And now as I think back, based on what I know, what I realize is, well, what I could have done and what I wish that I had done at the time was try to at least connect with her and try to find out who that woman was, and either speak to her in the hall or speak to her in the laundry room or something to say, I'm concerned about you, and if there's anything I can do to help, here's my phone number, whatever, or here's a phone number for the shelter or the crisis line. something to give her a connection and an acknowledgement that somebody is listening, somebody knows what's going on and cares about that. So I think in that sort of public setting, that any way that we can simply communicate to someone that we realize what's happening to them and care about them, even if they are resistant and basically turn away from that because they're afraid to make that connection with us. It still sort of plants the seed that somebody cares and that there are resources out there. If somebody comes to me and begins to share something with me about problems in our marriage, or you know, my husband just lost his job and things are really difficult at home, and so they're kind of hints that something's going on, I'm going to try with that person to just create some openness for them to share as much as they feel safe sharing at that point. And tell me more about that. Tell me what happens when do you argue with your husband? What happens when you argue? How does that, you know, what do you do? What does he do? And try to gather some information. And frankly, in that situation, I would try to work towards literally asking her, has he ever hit you? Do you feel afraid? Do you feel like you could leave if you wanted to try to discern, try to get some assessment of what's going on here in terms of the coercion that she's experiencing, but also the literal violence or the threat of violence that she or the children may be experiencing. And again, what I'm trying to do is open the door so that she can name what's going on. And I would never use, this is one hint, is to never use language there of, is he abusing you or battering you, or is this domestic violence? When we use those terms with people, they would always say no, because they don't want to name it. They don't want to acknowledge that that's what's going on. So what I'm trying to do is help her describe what she's experiencing in order then to figure out what kind of resources might be useful to her. So in trying to get that information, then I'm going to be offering, you know, I'm always here if you want to talk, but also here are some resources. If you feel like you do want to get away, if you want to take a break and be in a safe place, here's a place for you to go. And it's okay for you to do that. It's a good thing for you to do that if you want to do that, and so forth. But finally, it's her decision how she's going to deal with this, because she's the one who knows best how to cope with the danger that she and the children are facing. And so I'm never going to be directive at that point and say, you know, you should do this, that, or the other thing. But here are your options, and I will support you and walk with you through that.
One last question, which bridges on to this what you've just been talking about, is someone says, I've heard the term safety plan. Can you talk a little bit about that briefly?
Yeah, a safety plan is a resource for a battered woman who's trying to figure out how to cope with and survive the dangerous situation she's in. Because for those of us on the outside who've not experienced this, it's very easy to, if we become aware of what she's dealing with, to say, why don't you just leave? Or to project our experience and say, if I were in that situation, I would just leave. Well, that's not true, because just leaving in that sense is a very dangerous thing. And in fact, we know in terms of the homicide statistics that when battered women do choose to leave a situation, to either go to a shelter or go to a family member or just remove themselves, is the most dangerous time. because the abuser is very likely to escalate his effort to control and to use violence to do that. So, and she knows that because he threatened her probably with, if you try to leave, I will do this, this, and this. And so we need to again, not project that onto her and as if, you know, all you need to do is get up and leave. But in fact, what she needs is a plan. She needs to to carefully plan. If she's going to leave, there's got to be a plan to do that in a way in which she can be safe. But if she's not going to leave, if she chooses to stay there because she feels safer there than leaving, and I know that sounds contradictory, but it isn't for many people because she's survived there and coped with this probably over time. And she knows much better than any of us on the outside the nature of the violence of her partner and what he's capable of, what he's threatened, and so on and so on. So we have to respect her knowledge about that. But what we can offer her is the resource of a safety plan, which basically says, okay, kind of get your ducks in a row. And if this happens, what are your options literally in the moment? What are you going to do about this? And where are the kids? And if the kids are at school, how are you going to get out of that situation when he comes at you with a gun? Where are your car keys? Where are your papers? Do you have a backpack that you could grab on the run and literally get out the door? So you've got what you need and pick up the kids at school and get to a safe place and so forth. So it's helping her make that plan. It's helping her figure out what her options are, getting things organized, where would she go, who knows about this, who can she rely on, and so forth. But I also want to caution any of you who are clergy and functioning in the role of a faith leader as a support person. I don't think most of us have the training to be able to actually sit down and develop that plan with her. I don't feel comfortable doing that with an individual without the help of an advocate who knows much more about the detail of this than I do as a pastor. So this is the kind of thing that I would, if I were working with the woman, I would bring up to her as an option, that it would be really important for you to develop a safety plan and put that together. But in order to do that, I would suggest that we sit down with an advocate who has the experience and the training to do that and do that together. And ideally, I guess I'm saying that the three of us would sit down and work on that, and she would put her safety plan together based on the advice and the experience of an advocate. So in any case, it's a concept that I think is more people are aware of now as a resource, and I certainly support and encourage it. But I wouldn't assume the capacity of a faith leader to be able to help her do that in isolation from other resource people. So that would be the ideal scenario.
Okay, that was our last question.
Okay, so let me just go to the resources and highlight a few things for you then.
Okay.
In terms of print materials, what you can get from us here at Faith Trust, my little book on keeping the faith is directed specifically at Christian women, answering some of their questions, some of the questions we've talked about today, but just trying to help clarify those struggles that they have with the teachings that they've learned within Christian settings. You're Not Alone, Inspiration for Domestic Violence Survivors by Toby Landsman is for Jewish women, and then What Islam Says About Domestic Violence for Muslim women. So again, similar resources, very accessible to everybody in those faith traditions. Broken Vows and To Save a Life and Garments for One Another are DVDs that we offer here at Faith Trust. Broken Vows portrays the experience of Christian and Jewish women and some of the struggles there and some of the resources. To Save a Life focuses on Jewish communities, and Garments focuses on Muslim families. And again, those are good teaching tools, but I think they're also useful resources if you had a group of people that you're working with from a particular tradition, that it would be a way to open up that conversation. And finally, for those of you who are in agencies as advocates and you're dealing with people from a variety of different religious backgrounds, the publication Walking Together, Working with Women from Diverse Religious and Spiritual Traditions is intended to give you some insight into a variety of traditions as to what's going on here. What's a woman from a Buddhist background struggling with that you might be trying to assist in your setting. So that's a good kind of resource book to have within your agency, because you can refer to it as needed in working with people from a number of different backgrounds. So those are the things that we can offer to you here at Faith Trust. As Jane said earlier, we have ongoing series of webinars around particular issues, and we go deeper into some of the things we've talked about today. And certainly those webinars are all accessible to you in our archive, and I would encourage you to go there. So thank you very much for the opportunity to spend this hour with you, and I hope it's been helpful. And Jane, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fortune. And so as we close this webinar today, you'll be prompted to fill out a short survey. And so please take a moment to complete it and let us know what you think about this webinar and have any ideas or feedback that you want to share with us about future webinars. And visit our website for information about upcoming webinars in our 2014 schedule. And then that concludes this presentation today. So thank you very much for joining us. And again, thank you to the Lutheran Community Foundation for their sponsorship of this webinar series. Goodbye now.